It had been a brutal week, deadlines, late nights, and way too much coffee. By Friday, I was running on fumes, but I still stayed late at the office trying to get ahead for once. By the time I finished, it was past midnight, and to make things worse, a storm had rolled in. The rain was relentless, pouring so hard it was like the streets were underwater. I stood outside the office, drenched even under the awning, and realized I'd missed the last bus. I thought about waiting for a rideshare, but in the middle of the night in this weather I wasn't optimistic. A taxi appeared down the street, its headlights flickering in the rain. It looked old and a little beat up, but I was too tired and soaked to care. I waved it down, and it pulled up to the curb. The cab was as rough inside as it was outside, dim lighting, worn seats, and an odd smell that I couldn't quite place. The driver was an older man, maybe in his 50s, with tired eyes and a quiet demeanor. He nodded at me but didn't say a word as I climbed in and shut the door. "Thanks," I mumbled, trying to shake off the water from my jacket. He didn't respond, just started driving. As we pulled away, I settled into the back seat, hoping for a quiet ride. But something about the atmosphere didn't feel right. There was this faint, burnt smell, like metal or rubber that clung to the air. The rearview mirror was cracked and tilted in a way that didn't seem useful. The driver didn't even use it, he kept glancing at me through the windshield reflection instead. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. It was late, I was exhausted, and the rain was making everything feel strange. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The driver's hands gripped the wheel too tightly, and every now and then, his eyes flicked toward the passenger seat like he was checking for something. The rain kept pounding against the windows, drowning out every other sound. It felt like we were in a bubble, just me, the driver, and the hum of the engine. We were maybe 10 minutes into the ride when the driver finally spoke. His voice was low and rough, cutting through the quiet like a knife. "Whatever you do," he said slowly, "don't look behind you." I froze. At first, I thought I misheard him. "What?" I asked, leaning forward slightly. He didn't look at me. His eyes stayed glued to the road. "Don't look behind you," he repeated, his tone sharper this time. I let out a nervous laugh. "Is this a joke?" He didn't answer. He just kept driving, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The tension in the cab was suffocating. My mind raced. Was he messing with me, trying to scare me, or was there actually something behind me? I felt my body tense as the urge to look grew stronger. My pulse quickened and I cleared my throat, trying to break the silence. "Why?" I asked, my voice shaky now. "Why shouldn't I look?" "Just don't," he said, his voice firm and steady. "Whatever you do, don't look." I sat back, gripping the edge of my seat. My heart was pounding. I tried to laugh it off. "You're kidding, right?" I asked, trying to sound calm. The driver didn't respond. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, and his eyes stayed fixed on the road. "Seriously," I said, leaning forward a little. "What's that supposed to mean?" Still nothing. The cab was silent, except for the sound of the rain hitting the windows and the hum of the engine. I leaned back, my stomach tightening. The air in the car felt heavier, like the space around me was closing in. I glanced out the window, searching for anything strange outside, but all I saw were empty streets and rain-soaked sidewalks. "Don't look behind you." The words echoed in my head. Was he trying to mess with me? Was this some kind of weird joke? Or was there really something back there? The burnt smell I'd noticed earlier was stronger now, sharp and sour. I shifted in my seat, trying to ignore it, but it made my throat feel dry. I glanced at the driver. His knuckles were white as he gripped the wheel, and his lips were moving slightly, like he was muttering something under his breath. "Hey," I said, trying to break the silence. "Are you okay?" He didn't answer. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, then back to the road. I glanced at the mirror too, but it was cracked and tilted awkwardly. All I could see was a distorted reflection of the back seat and part of my face. The temperature in the cab felt like it had dropped. I rubbed my arms, wishing I had a thicker coat. The AC wasn't on though. In fact, the vents weren't blowing anything at all. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the rain or the wind outside, but as I listened more closely, it sounded different. Faint whispers, just on the edge of hearing. I froze, trying to make sense of it. Was it the radio? No, the radio was off. Was it the driver? But his lips were barely moving, and whatever he was muttering didn't match the whispers. I turned my head slightly, straining to listen. The whispers were too quiet to make out, like dozens of voices speaking all at once. Then I heard a faint shuffle, like movement coming from the back seat. My chest tightened. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe the cab's old upholstery was just shifting as we drove. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me because I was tired, but the whispers didn't stop. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The driver didn't respond. His eyes stayed glued to the road, and his hands gripped the wheel even tighter. "Hey," I said again, louder this time. "What's going on?" Finally, he spoke. His voice was low and tense, like he was trying to stay calm. "I told you," he said. "Don't look behind you." I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. His tone wasn't teasing or joking. It was dead serious. "Why?" I asked, my throat dry. "Why shouldn't I look?" "Just don't," he said firmly, his voice almost shaking. "Trust me, don't." I sat there, frozen in place. I wanted to turn around so badly, to prove to myself there was nothing there. But at the same time, I was terrified of what I might see. The whispers were louder now, almost rhythmic, and the burnt smell was overwhelming. I gripped the edge of my seat, staring straight ahead, trying to focus on the road ahead of us. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. As the taxi drove on, I realized we weren't heading the usual way to my place. The streets were getting darker and emptier, with no sign of life. "Hey," I said, leaning forward. "This doesn't look right. Are you sure this is the way?" "It's a shortcut," the driver replied, his voice flat. "A shortcut?" I looked out the window at the rundown buildings and empty streets. It didn't feel like a shortcut. It felt like we were heading somewhere no one was supposed to be. I glanced out the side window again, hoping to recognize something, anything. That's when I saw it. A shadow in the road behind us. At first, I thought it was just another car without its headlights on. But then I noticed the way it moved. It wasn't steady, it flickered, almost like it was skipping forward. "Do you see that?" I asked the driver. He didn't respond, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened. The whispers in the car grew louder, forming broken, half-heard words. "Don't stop. They see you." I clenched my fists, my heart racing. The shadow was still there, but it wasn't acting like a car or a person. It was something else. The cab stopped at a red light, and the tension in the air was unbearable. The driver broke the silence with a whisper. "It's closer now." "What is?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. His face was pale, and his eyes darted nervously to the mirror. I sat there, frozen. I could feel something behind me, even though I hadn't turned around. My mind was screaming at me to look, to prove to myself that nothing was there. I gripped the seat, my heart pounding. Should I look? Was it all in my head? Or was something really there? I couldn't help it. I turned my head just enough to glance over my shoulder. Nothing. The back seat was empty, just like I thought. I let out a shaky laugh and turned back to the front. "See? There's nothing there." "You shouldn't have done that," the driver said sharply, cutting me off. His voice sent a chill through me. "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach sinking. "There's nothing there." "You looked," he said, his voice low and almost panicked. "Now it knows you saw it." "What are you talking about?" I stammered, feeling the fear creep back in. The driver glanced at the rearview mirror, his face pale. It's never in the back seat. It's behind the car. I froze. Slowly, I turned my gaze to the window, looking at the reflection of the street behind us. The shadow was still there, but now it was clearer, solid, dark, and moving closer. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a rush of frantic, broken words. Run! Too late. The driver slammed on the gas and the car jolted forward. I grabbed the door handle to steady myself, my heart racing. "What is that?" I shouted, my voice breaking. "Don't stop," the driver said, his voice shaking. "Whatever happens, we can't stop." I pressed myself back into the seat, my chest tight with fear. Outside, the shadow kept pace with the car. It wasn't walking or running, it was floating, shifting like smoke, and it was getting closer. The air in the cab felt heavier and colder, making it harder to breathe. My chest felt tight, like something was pressing down on me. I glanced around nervously. The shadows inside the car didn't look right. They seemed to shift and stretch, almost like they were alive. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but then I looked at the rearview mirror. I froze. In the cracked glass, I saw a face. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't the driver's. It was pale, with sunken, empty black eyes and a mouth that hung open too wide to be natural. It stared back at me, motionless. I blinked, hoping it was a trick of the light, but the face didn't go away. The driver slammed his hand on the dashboard, breaking the silence. "Don't look at it!" he shouted, his voice shaking. He stomped on the gas and the car sped forward, jerking so hard I nearly hit my head on the seat in front of me. The driver started muttering under his breath, some kind of chant or prayer I couldn't understand. Outside, the world blurred by. The city lights were gone, replaced by endless dark streets that felt like they were leading nowhere. Then I felt it. An icy breath brushed the back of my neck and I froze. My entire body was covered in goosebumps. That's when I heard it, a deep, guttural growl coming from right behind me. "Do you feel that?" I whispered, barely able to speak. "Don't talk to it," the driver snapped. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his whole body tense. The lights inside the cab flickered, plunging us into brief moments of darkness. The radio, which had been silent, suddenly erupted with loud static. The steering wheel jerked on its own and the car swerved violently. I slammed against the door, gripping the seat for dear life. "What's happening?" I yelled, my voice trembling. "It's here," the driver said through gritted teeth. "Hold on." The growling behind me grew louder, mixed with strange whispers that sounded almost like laughter. I could feel something getting closer, the cold in the air growing sharper. The car screeched to a stop, throwing me forward. I looked up, disoriented, and saw that we were in the middle of nowhere, a narrow road surrounded by dark trees. The driver turned to me, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "Get out!" he yelled. "What?" I stammered, frozen in my seat. "Get out!" he screamed, his voice desperate. "If you stay, it'll take us both." My hands fumbled with the door, and I stumbled out onto the wet pavement, rain soaking through my clothes. The driver slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. I stood there, shivering and confused, watching as the driver gripped the wheel tightly. Shadows swirled inside the car, darker and thicker than before. Then everything went silent. The growling stopped, the whispers vanished, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Suddenly, the driver's head snapped back and all the windows shattered at once. A loud, deafening roar filled the air, and the shadows completely swallowed the car. I stumbled backward, falling onto the ground. When I looked up, the car was gone. It had vanished, as if it had never been there. I sat there in the rain, gasping for air, my body trembling. My mind couldn't process what had just happened, but deep down, I knew one thing. I wasn't alone anymore. As soon as the car vanished, I ran. The rain was pouring and my legs felt like they might give out, but I didn't stop. All I could think about was getting away. The road was narrow, lined with trees that seemed to stretch toward me like they were alive. My heart was pounding so hard it drowned out the sound of the rain. Then I heard it. A low growl, deep and guttural, coming from behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't, but I could feel it. Something was chasing me, closing the distance. Up ahead, I saw a light, a gas station. I pushed myself harder, my feet slipping on the wet pavement as I ran toward it. Almost there, I whispered to myself, barely able to breathe. The growling grew louder, and for a moment I thought I wouldn't make it. But the second I stepped into the light, the sound stopped. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. A man in a gas station uniform rushed toward me, his face full of concern. "Are you okay?" he asked. I tried to speak, but no words came out. My whole body was shaking. "What happened?" he asked again, kneeling beside me. I turned and looked behind me, expecting to see the shadow lurking at the edge of the light. But there was nothing. The man helped me inside, where it was warm and bright. I sat down, still trembling, as he handed me a bottle of water. "There was a taxi," I finally said, my voice shaking. Something was following us." The man frowned. "A taxi? Out here?" I nodded. "It disappeared. I don't know how, but it was just gone." The man looked skeptical, but he didn't argue. "Do you want me to call the police?" "Yes," I whispered. When the police arrived, I told them everything, the driver, the shadow, the whispers. I expected them to ask questions, to investigate, but they mostly just looked at each other like I was crazy. "Are you sure you weren't imagining things?" one of them asked. "It's late and you've been through a lot." I insisted it was real, but when they checked the road, they found nothing. No car, no broken glass, no tire marks, nothing. In the end, they said I must have been confused, maybe even hallucinating from exhaustion and the storm. I couldn't let it go. Over the next few days, I searched the internet for anything that might explain what happened. That's when I found a story about a cursed taxi. According to the legend, the taxi appears to people traveling alone late at night. The driver is trapped, doomed to save passengers from the shadow that follows the car. If you look back, the shadow locks onto you. It sounded ridiculous, but it matched what happened to me exactly. For weeks, I avoided going out at night. I locked my doors and windows every evening, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. One night, as I sat in my living room, I heard whispers. At first, they were faint, barely noticeable, but they grew louder, filling the room. My stomach dropped. I walked slowly to the window and peeked out through the curtain. Standing under the street lamp, just beyond the reach of the light, was the shadow. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. I pulled the curtain shut, my hands shaking. The whispers stopped, but I knew it was still there, and I knew it wasn't going anywhere. I still don't know exactly what happened that night, and I'm not sure I ever will, but I want to know, what would you have done in my place? Have you ever experienced anything like this? If this story gave you chills or kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to like, share, and comment with your own spooky experiences. I'd love to hear them.